Okay, let's dive in. Why is the United States military using kinetic force, actively seeking out and destroying vessels off the coast of Venezuela?
Yeah, and describing the people on those boats with language that, frankly, we used to reserve for groups like Al-Qaeda.
Exactly. That's the question, really, at the heart of this naval escalation that everyone's talking about.
It really is the central tension here. You've got this U.S. naval buildup, confirmed kinetic strikes near Venezuela, and it sparks some serious debate.
Mm-hmm.
Officially, the administration is framing these actions as direct self-defense. They're pointing fingers at designated terrorist organizations.
Specifically cartels, right? Bringing drugs to the U.S.
Exactly. Cartels bringing deadly drugs to American streets. That's the official line.
So our deep dive today for you, the listener, is designed to give you the full picture. We're pulling information from official announcements, policy analysis from places like the Heritage Foundation, AEI,
Conservative think tanks, yeah.
and also specific intelligence reports on, well, weapons proliferation.
Which is a huge piece of this puzzle.
Right. So our mission is really to unpack this whole high-stakes security posture. We'll focus on the official justification combating narco-terrorism, but also the really profound long-term security risks.
Risks posed by Venezuela's massive arsenal, largely supplied by Russia.
Yeah. This is definitely far more complicated than your standard drug interdiction operation.
And what's really striking, I think, is how quickly this seems to have shifted. It went from, a law enforcement problem
Right.
to a military one.
Yeah.
And that shift in language, the way they're talking about it, that's absolutely key to understanding the policy.
Okay, so let's unpack that shift then, because it really is the defining characteristic of the U.S. approach right now. The Trump administration formally determined that the U.S. is now in a, what do they call it, a non-international armed conflict.
That's the term, a non-international armed conflict, or NIAC.
Yeah.
And that designation, it changes everything, legally, operationally.
How so?
Well, once you classify something as an NIAC, you immediately invoke the law of armed conflict. And that authorizes the military, not just law enforcement, to use lethal force against the designated groups. So, it stops being about making an arrest.
It's about engaging an enemy threat.
Precisely.
But, okay, what's the specific legal rationale? How do they justify striking vessels, maybe killing people on them, outside of what we'd normally think of as a war zone?
It comes down to self-defense. But it's applied in a pretty novel way here. You had Defense Secretary Hegseth announcing strikes on boats near Venezuela.
Right, I remember that.
And he stated very clearly these vessels were trafficking drugs, quote, headed to America to poison our people.
Wow.
So the administration's argument is this. The drugs smuggled by these cartels kill tens of thousands of Americans every year.
A staggering number.
It is. And they basically calculate this death toll as constituting an armed attack against U.S. citizens.
Okay, so the policy essentially treats this massive flow of deadly drugs causing mass casualties inside the U.S. as an act of war, not just a crime, however serious.
That's exactly it. And Hegseth drew that line very explicitly. He said, look, if foreign terrorist organizations are poisoning Americans with drugs, it's, quote, no different from Al-Qaeda, and they'll be treated as such.
So a direct equivalence.
They view it as an immediate national security threat, one that demands a lethal military response to eliminate that threat at its source, before it even hits the U.S.
And the rhetoric certainly matches the action. The source material we looked at details President Trump's warning. He said the U.S. military will, quote, blow you out of existence to every terrorist thug smuggling drugs.
Strong words.
And we know these are kinetic operations. There was one report citing a strike that killed, I think, 4 alleged narco-terrorists on a smuggling boat. Yeah. So it really shows they're committed to this new legal framework.
It's a radical pivot, really, in counter-narcotics policy. Using the law of armed conflict means the U.S. military is deploying resources, lethal force, things normally reserved for fighting established terror networks. But they're using it now to try and secure the Western Hemisphere from these transnational criminal organizations. The goal seems to be deterrence. Show absolute lethal consequences if you target U.S. citizens with these drugs.
Okay, so that addresses the immediate, the very visible kinetic part of this. But if we kind of peel back the layers in the source material, this drug fight, as deadly as it is, it seems interwoven with an even bigger, maybe catastrophic long-term security threat.
Yeah, and that's rooted in the collapse of the Maduro regime itself and its huge military stockpiles.
That's the strategic dimension, isn't it?
Absolutely. The crisis in Venezuela, it's not just about who controls drug routes. It's about the instability of a regime that's basically sitting on a mountain of high-grade weapons.
Weapons supplied by adversaries.
Right. Over the last 2 decades, Venezuela has built up one of the largest military stockpiles in the Western Hemisphere. And it was purchased largely with, get this, over $10 billion in Russian weapons.
$10 billion in Russian hardware, and
Yeah.
well, that's significant. And the sources are suggesting the security of that arsenal is shaky at best.
Completely doubtful. That's the fear. It's because of the systemic corruption inside the regime. You hear reports detailing the rise of these narco-generals.
Narco-generals.
Yeah, military
That's-
officials apparently deeply corrupted by drug money who have control over huge chunks of the armories.
Okay.
So the nightmare scenario is this. If the government collapses suddenly, these individuals might just decide to sell off advanced weaponry for personal profit.
Creating a weapons bonanza.
Exactly. A weapons bonanza that could destabilize the entire region for years.
And the most alarming detail, the one that really jumped out at me from the intelligence reports, it's the sheer number and type of one specific weapon system. The 5,000 Iglias man-pads.
Yes. Man-pads, man-portable air defense systems.
Shoulder-fired missiles, right?
That's right. Shoulder-fired, heat-seeking missiles, 5,000 of them. They're portable, incredibly lethal, and pretty easy to conceal.
And their range.
They're designed to engage targets up to about 15,000 feet. The sources are really explicit on this point. These man-pads pose a considerable threat to civil aviation.
Because they can take down a civilian airliner?
Yeah, anything flying below, say, 20,000 feet is potentially vulnerable.
So if even a small fraction of those 5,000 missiles, if they went missing or were sold off to criminal groups or terrorists,
You'd have an immediate serious threat to commercial air travel across the Caribbean, parts of North and South America.
is there any evidence suggesting this kind of proliferation might already be happening? What do the sources say?
Well, the evidence points to long-standing ties, documented connections between parts of the Venezuelan military and designated terrorist groups.
Like who?
Groups like the Colombian ELN, factions of the FARC. There are reports the Venezuelan military has been directly arming these groups. And beyond that, you've had criminal organizations like Brazil's PCC already caught smuggling Venezuelan military weapons. So it suggests an active supply chain for sophisticated arms is, well, already operational to some extent.
And layered on top of the weapons threat, there's the sheer human cost of the instability in Caracas. It's already created Latin America's worst humanitarian crisis.
Precisely.
Yeah.
The regime's collapse has triggered this just unprecedented refugee and migration exodus.
Overwhelming neighbors like Colombia and Brazil.
Yeah, they're struggling to handle millions of displaced people. And that kind of mass migration destabilizes the whole continent, really. It creates a vacuum that criminal groups and adversarial states are more than happy to exploit.
Okay, so we have this picture emerging. The self-defense argument against narco-terror on one side, and on the other, this enormous long-term risk of weapons proliferation, especially those man-pads. Which brings us to the third layer, maybe, the geopolitical stakes. Some critics suggest the U.S. military presence isn't just about counter-narcotics, that it might be driven by other goals, maybe challenging U.S. adversaries.
Well, if you look at the policy analyses,
Yeah.
particularly from conservative think tanks like Heritage and AEI that you mentioned,
Yeah.
they definitely frame this in terms of strategic competition.
Yeah.
They point out, pretty bluntly actually, that regime change in Venezuela would be, quote, pretty convenient for the U.S.
Convenient because
because the Maduro government actively makes deals with American adversaries. Think Iran, China, giving them a strategic foothold right here in the Western Hemisphere.
And the regime's survival itself, it seems almost entirely dependent on outside help, right? Two key actors.
That's right, Russia and Cuba. Cuba is especially critical for the regime's stability.
So,
Well, Cuba's own economic survival depends heavily on Venezuelan subsidies and aid. And in return, Cuba has literally thousands of officials embedded deep within Maduro's security and intelligence services.
embedded, like propping up the regime from the inside.
That's the argument from the policy analysis, yeah. That this Cuban support is essential. It's what's prolonging the crisis.
So what's the recommendation from these policy analysts then, if Russia and Cuba are the problem?
It's pretty clear. It will marry the cost of that external interference.
Make it painful for them to stay involved.
Exactly. They see Russia's meddling as, as strategic distraction tactic and Cuba's support as basically life support for the regime. So they urged the U.S. to use targeted sanctions
Against two specific
against Russian entities, Russian-backed entities, anyone providing that security assistance. The idea is to cut off the oxygen supply to Maduro, essentially, and send a strong signal that interference will have serious economic and diplomatic consequences.
Okay. Before we wrap this up, we should probably touch on the oil debate. It comes up a lot. The source material seems to have conflicting views on this.
Yeah, it's contentious. On one side, you have some analysts arguing the U.S. still needs Venezuela's specific type of heavy crude for certain refineries back home.
Right. That argument.
But the counter view, and it's pretty strong in some of the sources, rejects that completely.
Yeah.
They argue Venezuelan oil is actually the heaviest and therefore least valuable oil in the world. Some call it very poor quality. Plus, they point out America's already a net oil producer now. So the argument goes, the huge political and economic cost of any kind of military action, let alone war, would just vastly outweigh any potential benefit from Venezuelan oil.
So for the geopolitical argument, the focus remains less on oil reserves and more on removing that adversarial military and intelligence presence.
That seems to be the main thrust, yeah.
Right.
Removing the foothold for Iran, China, Russia, Cuba, not so much securing specific energy barrels.
Okay, so let's try and synthesize this. It's a complex picture. You have the U.S. using military force, framing it as self-defense against a designated terror threat, specifically targeting drug smuggling vessels, potentially killing people on board. Lethal. But this immediate action is playing out against this massive backdrop of potential regional collapse in Venezuela. Huge weapons proliferation risks, especially those thousands of man-pads.
Big OAS systems, yeah. Very dangerous.
And then there's the whole layer of geopolitical maneuvering with adversary meddling from Russia and Cuba.
The policy challenge here is just immense. Whatever the immediate intention is, whether it's purely counter-narcotics or maybe broader pressure on the regime, the U.S. has to grapple with the potential fallout if that regime actually destabilizes further or collapses.
And the sources warn about that fallout.
They do. They warn the risk of a weapons bonanza or even full-scale civil war is really high. And history kind of suggests military action often leads to, well, civil war, armed chaos, and persistent instability.
And if that happens,
then the U.S. could find itself committed to a very long-term, very high-cost peacekeeping role. Nobody really wants that.
That risk of long-term commitment plus the immediate threat of those weapons getting loose. It brings us to our final provocative thought for you, the listener, to maybe chew on. If the U.S. actions do contribute to eliminating the Maduro regime, who realistically has the capacity to move in quickly enough to secure those 5,000 advanced IGLES man-pads.
Before they inevitably fall into the wrong hands.
Exactly. Before they end up with transnational criminal organizations or terrorist groups, placing civilian air travel across the entire hemisphere under immediate catastrophic threat.
That really is the potential consequence of unchecked instability in Caracas. A sobering thought.